What is up? It's Aboveup, and we're gonna talk about Resident Evil 4 and why the intro to the game works so well. Resident Evil 4 is one of those games that I would consider a perfect game. I don't mean that in the sense that the game itself is entirely perfect and without fault. I mean that in the sense of, at any point, I could turn this game on and I could play it and just absolutely love it. So many years have passed since the game has come out, and I still absolutely appreciate everything about this game. It's something that's especially impressive considering the game came out in 2005. The game is more than 10 years old, and it's still very well designed. 4 was the first Resident Evil to really become an action title. During the early showings and press releases, they would always stress how, unlike previous titles, there are no moments of downtime. You are always being chased. Enemies can open and break doors, they throw objects after you. It was new territory for the series, and the design of the start of the game had to accommodate for these changes in how it flows, teaching players not just the new mechanics, but letting one of the hidden mechanics come into play early. I will come back to this later. One of the first moments you have control, there's already a small thing that will separate veterans from new players. For a new player, the effect of seeing the birds fly away as you run towards them, it looks like a cool graphical effect. Experienced Resident Evil 4 players recognize the birds as a good source for ammo and money. There's quite a few situations like this in the game, and you likely won't get into too much trouble for not being aware of it immediately. In fact, experienced players might have more need for larger amounts of ammo, as I'll mention later. I always liked the scene when you meet your first villager. In a way, it reminds me of the first zombie encounter in Resident Evil 1. That scene stressed the zombies being inhuman, while Resident Evil 4's scene puts emphasis on the villagers having humanity left. The scene also serves as one of the first bits of action. Almost every new enemy in Resident Evil 4 is shown off in a secluded or at least easier state than their normal encounters. Immediately after that, you face 3 villagers, 2 with a single weapon just like the one in the house and 1 with a pitchfork. There's a small shack with a typewriter to save your game before moving on. Interesting to note that previous Resident Evil games, saving would usually have an entirely safe room for you to save your game in. Although you're quite safe in this shack, it is still located within the same game map as the rest of this entire area. It's a small touch, but it does hint at the concept of there never being a safe space that the earlier marketing for the game was going for. Shortly after that, you get into the deep moral choice of rescuing the dog. I know it's something that sounds ridiculous to miss because of his barking, but if you're playing the game without sound and run straight forward, you actually won't notice him. I can't help but feel that he's there to test to see if the player's actually paying attention, especially because the rest of the area is kind of doing that exact thing. For instance, if you run straight ahead from the house past the dog, you run straight into a bear trap. Not only that, but the game tries to distract you with 2 obvious explosive wire traps set between trees, only to hide a bear trap right in the middle of the safe path. Once you've passed the traps, there's another small wooden shack waiting for you. This time it has a healing item and 2 wooden boxes in it. Also the dead body of a villager stuck to the wall that has one of the best lines in the game, if you care to examine it. You pass 2 more enemies and make it across a bridge before running into a group of enemies you can't shoot. Note how your gun's red dot isn't registering them, because they're not targets. I always found this a clever way to underline the effect of your handgun's red dot while aiming. There's another wooden shack here, though this is the one where the game tries to get you. Twice have they given you a safe space with healing items and even a typewriter before this, and now they ambush you. Once again, underlining the concept that you are not safe, that the marketing for the game was going for. After this, you get your first gauntlet. Gauntlets are the bread and butter of combat in Resident Evil 4. The game will lock you in an area, forcing you to fight until all enemies have been defeated. There's a few things to be said about this fight. For one, the area is mostly circular with a few dead ends in the design, most of which can be used to weed out smaller groups of enemies with shotguns or grenades, though sticking around for too long can get you killed later on. During most fights, the idea is to keep moving, creating distance between you and the enemies while you weed out targets whenever you have time. Running for cover in one of the 2 houses will either lead you to a complete dead end on a steel door, or a house triggering a cutscene with the strongest enemy you could face right now. The cutscene also conveys the idea of shoving furniture in front of windows, leaving another clear for you to do it yourself, showing you the mechanic, and then asking you to repeat it. If you're a new player, there's a good chance you'll get your ass kicked in this fight, likely even more than once. If you're a veteran of the game, it'll be incredibly easy for you. You'll likely kill the chainsaw guy for the money he drops. You don't have to win this fight the same way you have to win most gauntlets in Resident Evil 4. After a certain amount of time, a bell chimes and the villagers all walk away. The only real job you have is to survive. You're not entirely expected to fight back all the way just yet. though you are rewarded for it. Most importantly, the game's hidden mechanic is at work during this fight. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that this game has a hidden mechanic. I think the introduction works entirely because of this. Resident Evil 4's difficulty is adjusted based on how well you play. I can't say for sure, but I believe Devil May Cry's style system, rewarding combos and good play with more money, is a direct result of earlier testing of it. If you mess up a QTE, get hit by a trap, or die, the difficulty is lowered. On the other hand, if you play very well, the difficulty is brought up. While there are difficulty settings in the main menu, it does mean you can get brought up to the unlockable professional difficulty while starting out on normal. The game doesn't tell you it's doing this, probably so people not aware of the mechanic don't get too prideful about their current status in the game. Not only is the first fight a baptism of fire of sorts, the game has already tested you from the beginning, since pitting you against small groups of enemies, bear traps, and that sneaky enemy in the wooden shack. Not only is the player testing out the mechanics and learning about the game, but in a sense, the game is doing the same about the player, adjusting itself to fit what the player needs. After Resident Evil 4 was a huge hit, a similar mechanic was used in God Hand, where the game would adjust the difficulty based on how well you play, except in God Hand's case, they don't really hide it this time, they just show it right on the screen as you play. God Hand even takes it to a level where you unlock extra boss fights in the middle of a stage just as a fuck you because the game is trying to kill you. The reason I consider Resident Evil's introduction to be so successful is because it's representative of the game as a whole. The first 10 minutes or so of Resident Evil 4 actually highlights what the rest of the game will be like, except it will readjust itself based on how well you played. Besides that, it actually does get harder over time. There is scaling in the difficulty, but there is a main thread that the difficulty scales itself around. And that is some ingenious level design that I would wish to see more in games when they actually introduce something like level scaling. Anyway, this was Aboveup. I hope you enjoyed this video. I enjoyed talking about Resident Evil 4, and I'll see you next video. See ya!